At a basic level, the duty of the police is to protect ordinary citizens and make sure that our laws and regulations are being followed. But for some members of law enforcement, the power that they gain as an authority figure emboldens them to carry out their most twisted and deepest desires. In today's episode, we'll be looking at just a few such cases as we examine two cops who turned out to be serial killers. David Allen Gore. David Allen Gore was born in Florida in 1953 and from a young age exhibited troublesome behaviors. As a teenager, he was fired from his first job as a gas station attendant after his boss discovered a hole in the women's bathroom which Gore used to peep at unsuspecting customers. Though he was never employed officially as a member of law enforcement, he became a volunteer sheriff's deputy as an adult, and on several occasions used his badge to carry out some of his crimes. Gore did not work alone as a killer. He had an accomplice, his cousin, Fred Waterfield, who was a year older and a New Jersey native. The two men would later be dubbed the Killing Cousins by the media. The pair operated in the Vero Beach and Indian River County areas of Florida during the 1980s. Gore and Waterfield first struck on February 19, 1981, when Gore lured 17-year-old Ying Ling into his truck by showing her his police badge. He subsequently drove the teenager to her home, where he encountered her mother, 48-year-old Xian Ling, and decided that she too would need to become one of their victims. Gore would later tell police that he tied Xiang to a tree where she choked to death, and he and Waterfield sexually assaulted Ying. After the two had died, Gore and Waterfield dismembered their bodies and put their remains into oil drums, which they then buried. The Killing Cousins' next victim was 35-year-old Judith Daly, who was visiting from California. On July 15th, almost 5 months after their first kill, Gore purposely damaged Judith's car in a way that made it impossible to use. Unable to start up her vehicle, Judith was left stranded and vulnerable, but was approached by Gore, who offered to give her a lift to the nearest telephone. Comforted by the fact he carried a police badge, Judith accepted the ride. But instead of driving her to the telephone booth as promised, Gore took her to a secluded area where they met Waterfield. The two men subsequently sexually assaulted and killed Judith. Gore claimed later that the men disposed of the 35-year-old's body in a swamp. Things took a turn for Gore, however, when he attempted to abduct a teenage girl in the weeks following Judith's death by using his police badge. The plot was unsuccessful, and the girl's father reported Gore's behavior to the sheriff's office, which subsequently stripped him of his volunteer badge. Just days later, police spotted Gore in the back seat of a woman's car, armed with a police scanner, handcuffs, and a pistol. He was taken in by law enforcement, and shortly thereafter, he was charged and convicted with armed trespassing. Though he was sentenced to 5 years behind bars, he was released on parole less than 2 years later, in March 1983. The next two victims of Gore and Waterfield were two 14-year-old hitchhiking girls they picked up on May 20th, 1983. Angelica Lavelle and Barbara Ann Bayer were subsequently taken to a secluded area where they were sexually assaulted, killed, and dismembered. The final known victims of the Killing Cousins were 17-year-old Lynn Elliott and 14-year-old Reagan Martin, two students at Vero Beach High School. The two girls were hitchhiking to Obaso Beach in Indian River County on July 26, 1983, when they were picked up by Waterfield and Gore. Gore drove them back to his parents' house, which was empty, but Waterfield decided to leave Gore alone with the two girls at this point. He claimed that he'd seen his sister on the drive, and that she'd seen him, and likely the two girls they were with. Waterfield added that he planned to go to his truck repair shop to make sure his sister didn't interrupt Gore. Gore placed the girls in separate rooms from one another and sexually assaulted Lynn first. He left her alive as he went to assault Reagan. During this assault, however, Lynn, with her hands tied behind her back, managed to escape out the front of the house. She ran from Gore and the property until she lost her footing and tripped on the driveway. Gore recalled, "I kept running after her, and then she tripped and fell, and then I caught up to her. I started dragging her back, and she was trying, resisting, fighting me, so I threw her to the ground. That's when I shot her in the head." Gore shot Lynn twice at point-blank range in the middle of his driveway. It was only then that he realized what he'd done, as there was a witness, a teenage boy riding his bike, who had seen everything. The boy fled the scene and alerted the police, which led to a 90-minute standoff between Gore and the authorities. Eventually, Gore was arrested, and 14-year-old Reagan Martin was rescued. She was found handcuffed in the attic, with electrical cords tied around her legs. On August 10th, 1983, Gore was charged with first-degree murder with 2 counts of kidnapping and 2 counts of sexual battery. In December of that year, he led police to the bodies of 3 of his victims. In March 1984, he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The following year, Waterfield was convicted of the murders of 14-year-olds Barbara Ann Beyer and Angelica Lavelle and was given life in prison with a minimum of 50 years. He had previously been convicted of manslaughter for failing to stop the death of Lynn Elliott and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Over the years, Gore made no secret of his lethal desires. He reported having a very strong compulsion to kill and told a psychiatrist that he had a separate personality that was being controlled by the devil. In a sworn deposition given at his murder trial, he stated, "It was like another control was over me, you know. I probably could be 2 people at one time. I know for a fact I was a separate person when I did these, and I wouldn't be on other occasions." He added that he didn't want to kill anyone, but his desire to take the lives of others was like an obsession. Despite Gore's statements, he was known to keep trophies from his victims. Most notably, he would collect their hair as keepsakes. He was also known to respond to letters while in prison, but it was noted that he never seemed remorseful for his actions. Instead, he frequently divulged the gory details of his crimes. The letters that Gore wrote, which included such gruesome information, helped to push Florida Governor Rick Scott to set a concrete execution date, as he showed such little care for his victims and the wrongdoings he had committed. Fred Waterfield is currently 71 and still in prison. He reportedly maintains his innocence to this day. David Allen Gore was executed by lethal injection on April 12, 2012, at the age of 58. Gerard John Schaefer Jr. Gerard John Schaefer Jr. was born on March 26, 1946, in Neenah, Wisconsin. By all accounts, his upbringing was described as troubled and turbulent due to several factors, most notably his father's alcoholism and verbal abuse, and the family's frequent relocations. In school, he was considered a loner, and he appeared to be particularly interested in bondage and sadomasochism from a young age, while he began peeping as a teenager. He reportedly attempted to achieve autoerotic asphyxia by tying himself to trees in secluded areas, something which would come up again in his later murders. Schaefer became a member of the Wilton Manors Police Department at the age of 25 in September 1971, having tried and failed to become a teacher for several years. Though he received 1 commendation during his time with the Wilton Manors Police, his tenure lasted just 6 months. His work performance was overall seen as poor, and he was dismissed when his superiors discovered that he frequently flagged down women motorists who'd committed minor traffic infractions. He would then take their personal details and use them to contact the women to ask them out. His inappropriate conduct was not tolerated by Wilton Manors Police, but did not stop Schaefer from gaining employment elsewhere in law enforcement. In 1972, he applied as a deputy with the Martin County Sheriff's Department in Florida and forged a letter of recommendation from his previous police employers, which led to him being offered a position. Schaefer's first victims were thankfully able to escape with their lives. 18-year-old Nancy Trotter and 17-year-old Paula Wells were hitchhiking on July 21, 1972, when they were picked up by Schaefer, who was on duty at the time. He took the pair to the city of Stuart, their intended destination, but eerily warned them about the dangers of accepting lifts from strangers. The girls explained that they planned to visit Jensen Beach the following day, and that neither of them was a Florida native. Schaefer took this opportunity to offer them a ride to the beach the following morning, which they accepted. However, instead of taking them there, he took them to a secluded forest area, stopping the car close to a dilapidated hut. He subsequently handcuffed and gagged the girls. He took Nancy to one tree, where her legs were tied to the trunk just below her knees, and a noose was placed around her neck. The position was so perilous that the 18-year-old had to stand on the tree's roots to prevent the rope from tightening. Paula was taken to another tree and bound in the same way. Schaefer told the girls they were about to be raped and murdered, but before he could make good on his promise, he was interrupted by a radio call that told him he was to immediately report to the police station. Schaefer left and returned 2 hours later to find that both girls were gone. He immediately called Sheriff Robert Crowder, telling him, "I've done something very foolish. You'll be mad at me." He explained that he was just trying to teach the girls a lesson about the dangers of hitchhiking, but that he had, quote, overdid the job, adding that he'd abandoned the two in swampland. Fortunately, Nancy was found swimming in a river, her hands still pinned behind her back and gags still over her mouth. Her clothing was torn and shredded in places. Paula was discovered shortly beforehand, wandering through the woodland in the direction of the highway. Both girls were understandably traumatized, but otherwise unharmed. Back at the police station, Nancy and Paula detailed their escape and their interactions with Schaefer. Though Schaefer claimed that he had simply gone too far when trying to warn the girls of the risks they took while hitchhiking rides from strangers, his version of events was not believed. He was promptly dismissed from the force and arrested, and charges of false imprisonment and aggravated assault were laid against him. However, 2 weeks later he posted bail, meaning he was a free man until his November trial. On September 27, 1972, Schaefer abducted 2 teenage girls, Susan Place, 17, and Georgia Jessup, 16. They'd encountered Schaefer, who had introduced himself as Jerry Shepard, in Fort Lauderdale while attending an adult education center, and he had quickly won their trust, likely by pretending to be interested in the same things as them. The 2 girls planned to go out with Schaefer to the beach for a few days, and told Susan's mother this when they introduced him to her. Susan's mother, Lucille, was suspicious of this Jerry Shepard and made note of his license plate number. Susan and Georgia were last seen leaving the Place property at 8:45 that night, in the company of Schaefer. When 4 days passed and there was no sign of Susan or Georgia, their parents grew concerned and reported their disappearances to the police. Though Lucille, Susan's mother, gave investigators the license plate number she'd written down, the registration was traced to a completely different vehicle in St. Petersburg. The owner of the car didn't match Schaefer's description either, and he had a solid alibi for the night of the girl's disappearance. The case quickly went cold. Schaefer, in the meantime, appeared in court in December of 1972. He entered into a plea bargain, which saw him plead guilty to 1 charge of aggravated assault, for which he was given 1 year in prison, with the possibility of parole after 6 months. He was also required to serve 3 years probation afterwards. He began serving his prison sentence in July of 1973. In the spring of 1973, there was a break in the Susan Place and Georgia Jessup case when Lucille Place discovered a letter in her daughter's room from Jerry Shepard. The return address of the letter led her to an apartment block where the building's manager informed her that the particular apartment she was looking for had been rented by Schaefer, who had recently been sent to prison for the abduction and attempted hanging of 2 girls. Lucille soon realized that she'd made a mistake, too, when noting down his license plate number. She'd incorrectly noted it as being registered in the wrong county. After she informed the police of this error, they traced the car to Schaefer, who denied all knowledge of Georgia or Susan, although Lucille identified him as the man who'd been in her daughter's room on the night she went missing. On April 1st, the heavily decomposed remains of 2 teenage girls were discovered in Oak Hammock Park in the city of Port St. Lucie, Florida. Parts of the bodies had been scattered away by wildlife, and very little clothing was found at the scene, though the most notable piece which still remained was a pair of jeans with a patch featuring Roadrunner, the cartoon bird from Looney Tunes. Both victims had been bound and murdered. Their spinal cords had been severed at the lumbar, and several bones had been severed with either a knife or machete. They had been decapitated post-mortem, and their jawbones showed signs of fractures. One body had a gunshot wound in the lower jaw, inflicted by a .22 caliber pistol. The bodies were soon identified as those of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. It was Georgia who owned the Roadrunner jeans. Shortly after the identification, the police established Schaefer as their prime suspect, based on his criminal conviction and Lucille Place's information. They immediately began to investigate. Inside his mother's residence, investigators recovered 300 pages of violent, twisted stories Schaefer had written over the years. They detailed the kidnapping, humiliation, sexual assault, and deaths of a number of teen girls and young women he hatefully referred to as whores and sluts. He wrote about how he'd frequently returned to the scenes of his crimes to carry out acts of necrophilia with the dismembered remains, and even sometimes extracted teeth from the skulls of his victims as keepsakes. Police also gathered up 11 guns, 13 hunting knives, sections of rope, and an abundance of softcore pornography from the home, much of which he'd modified to show naked women bound with ropes hanging from trees or bearing bullet wounds. Investigators also recovered 37 Polaroid photos depicting women being hanged or mutilated, and a letter from an Australian man he'd met in Morocco in 1970, which contained further Polaroid photos of a massacre of a village in Sahara. Most of the images showed mutilated women. More damning still was that Schaefer, like many serial killers, had kept trophies from his victims. Inside a jewelry box, authorities recovered personal possessions, including jewelry, passports, and clothing belonging to people believed to be his victims. One gold lock, inscribed with the name Lee, was linked to a missing woman named Lee Bonadice. She had been a neighbor of Schaefer's in 1969, and vanished in September of that year. Another piece of jewelry found, a heart-shaped charm with the initials MTN, has not been linked to anyone thus far. The driving license of Barbara Ann Wilcox was also recovered. Barbara was 19 when she vanished while hitchhiking from Sioux City, Iowa in January of 1973. She was traveling with Colette Goodenough, also 19. Colette's passport was discovered alongside Barbara's license. Schaefer was known to have been in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, around the time of their disappearances, and their remains were recovered in 1977, with evidence showing that they'd been suspended from trees at the scene where they were killed. Though Schaefer would only ever be charged with the murders of 2 people, he is strongly believed to have been a serial killer. The teeth and bones of at least 8 individuals were found at his mother's property. Further physical evidence was found in Schaefer's home, which he shared with his wife, including Georgia Jessup's suede handbag, which he had reportedly given to his wife as a gift in November of 1972, 2 months after her disappearance. They also found 2 human teeth, several knives and guns, and a heavily blood-stained pillowcase, which he'd obviously attempted to clean. By May of 1973, Schaefer had been linked to 9 murders and unsolved disappearances that had taken place between 1969 and 1973. Although one newspaper published a list of 28 murdered or missing individuals believed to be linked to the former policeman. On May 18, 1973, Schaefer was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. In September of that year, he was convicted of both counts. He was subsequently given 2 life sentences to be served concurrently. Schaefer continued to maintain his innocence, despite the evidence against him. He then claimed that Georgia Jessup and Susan Place were heroin users, police informants, and promiscuous, and even insulted their parents, all while he claimed that he had never met either girl. While in prison, Schaefer was a loner and outcast. Inmates didn't want to mix with him, as he had a reputation as a police informant, which wasn't entirely fictional, as he did help to put away several pedophiles while behind bars. Schaefer died on December 3rd, 1995, aged 49, after he was stabbed over 40 times by a fellow inmate, 32-year-old Vincent Rivera, who was already serving time for murder. Police officials stated that the two had gotten into an altercation over who received the final cup of hot water from a dispenser days before Schaefer's death. In 1999, Rivera was convicted of Schaefer's murder and given a further 53 years on top of his existing 20-year sentence. Rivera never confessed or offered up a motive for the killing, but it is suspected that Schaefer was killed for being an informant. In the year before his death, waste was thrown at him on numerous occasions, and his cell was set on fire twice. For many, the murder was a just and fitting end for one of Florida's most sadistic and cruel killers. And there you have the facts. Please leave a comment down below with your own thoughts and reactions, and remember to like this video and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.